On the afternoon of Wednesday, November 17, 2010, a 54-year-old woman named Diane Zaleski pulled her car into her driveway in Union Township, New Jersey, which is a small suburb of New York City. Diane was just about to get out of her car and go inside when her cell phone inside of her purse began to ring. She opened it up and she looked at her phone, and the caller ID said it was her sister-in-law, Debbie. So Diane picked it up and she said hello, and immediately Debbie asked her for a favor. She said that she needed someone to drive her to a doctor's appointment the next day, and she was wondering if Diane could do that. And Diane did not have to consult her calendar to know that her schedule tomorrow was wide open. Just a few months ago, she'd retired from her 17-year career as a legal secretary and then had moved to this particular neighborhood to be closer to her aging parents and her brother. And so her only job at the moment was helping out her family, which didn't take up all her time, and tomorrow she was free. So Diane told Debbie, that she'd see her tomorrow, and then the pair hung up. After that, Diane gathered up her things and got out of her car, and then as she was about to walk inside of her home, she stopped and just turned around and looked out at her new neighborhood. And it was really nice here. The block was full of all these beautiful homes and well-kept lawns. This was just a really nice place to live. And so as she was just, staring out at the scene, she saw the woman who lived across the street, her name was Mrs. Yearwood, dragging her garbage cans down to the curb. And so Diane, she waved to Mrs. Yearwood and smiled, and also made a mental note to ask Mrs. Yearwood if her son, whose name was Arnell, was free to shovel her, Diane's walkway tomorrow, because that night it was supposed to snow. Later that same night, sometime after 10 p.m., Diane was in bed with her laptop open, scrolling through messages on her online dating profile. Now, dating was sort of a normal part of Diane's life. She'd gone out with plenty of men over the years, and she still got hit on pretty aggressively at bars, and she'd even been proposed to once. But despite, meeting lots of men and liking quite a few of them, she just had never gotten married. These days, Diane met most of the men that she went on dates with online, like on a dating site. And on these sites, men seemed to always be messaging her to ask her out. And so far, of the men she actually wound up seeing, only a few had been creeps. And so over time, Diane had sort of cultivated this small roster of men that she kept in touch with and, would meet up with for dates. And so now Diane clicked on the profile for one of the men that was on her roster. It was a man named Kyle Porter. And she was just about to message him this very flirty message when she heard her doorbell downstairs ring. And when she heard this, she was sort of surprised because she definitely was not expecting anybody. But, she still obviously got out of bed and got herself together and headed downstairs to see who it was. And when she unlocked and opened the door, the person standing outside in the cold was somebody that she immediately recognized. Now, she really had no idea what they were doing here right now, but she told them to, come inside. And then asked them, what's going on? And then this visitor started talking, and they would say something that Diane never expected. The following day, around noon, Diane's 91-year-old father, Stanley Zaleski, was at home watching TV when his phone rang. He picked it up, and he heard the voice of his daughter-in-law, Debbie. And Debbie sounded really worried. And she quickly explained to him that Diane had agreed to drive her to a doctor's appointment that morning, but she hadn't shown up. And now, she was reaching out to Diane, but she wasn't answering, and she also wasn't responding to texts. And Stanley, much like Debbie, was very surprised by this, because this was not like Diane at all. So he told Debbie that he would go over to Diane's place right now and check on her, since after all, he lived a lot closer to Diane than Debbie did. Then they hung up, and Stanley yelled for his wife to come on with him. 20 minutes later, Stanley and his wife, Diane's mom, walked up to the front door of Diane's house. As soon as they got there, Stanley began pounding on the door, yelling for his daughter, but there was no answer. And so eventually, after looking at his wife, and they both are like, what's going on here? He reached down and he tried the door handle to see if the door was unlocked, and he found that it was. So he turned the handle, and he just pushed the door open, and immediately his eyes were drawn to the ground inside the house, like right in the foyer, because it was all red. There was blood everywhere. A wave of nausea came over Stanley, and he had to grab the door frame to steady himself. But then after a moment, he turned to his wife, who was right next to him, and he just said, "Stay right here. I'm going to go in and look around." And then he stepped inside, and as he moved further into the foyer, which again, there's just like blood splattered everywhere, he began to notice there were piles of strange white dust that he didn't recognize sort of amongst the blood. There's no sign of Diane, like it's silent in the house. But as Stanley's standing there, he sees that there's also what appears to be a pretty clear trail, like something had been dragged through the blood and was sort of pulled towards the back of the house. And so Stanley, with his heart racing, he began walking, like following this trail of whatever got dragged through the house, and it made its way to the top of the stairs that led down into the basement. And then when Stanley looked down into the basement, he saw something at the foot of the stairs, like a heap of something that was down there. And after a minute, once his eyes adjusted to the dark down there, he saw it was his daughter. And at that point, he sort of staggered back and he yelled out for his wife to call 911. Half an hour later, around 1 p.m, Detective Robert Henderson of the Union County Homicide Task Force drove his police cruiser into a very nice, quiet neighborhood. His partner, Detective Mike Minacchio, was sitting in the passenger seat. And at some point, Henderson, he pulled up to the snow-covered curb in front of a large house that was in the process of being roped off with crime scene tape. Henderson immediately noticed there was an elderly man and woman being interviewed by officers in the front yard of this house. And as soon as Detective Henderson and his partner got out of their cruiser, one of the officers who was out and about ran over to brief them on what the police knew so far. He explained that the elderly man and woman were the parents of the victim, Diane Zaleski. Diane lived alone, this was her home, and her parents had come over earlier and found her foyer covered in blood, and Diane was found lying dead at the bottom of the stairs in the basement. Henderson asked if there were any signs of a break-in or a robbery, and the officer said no, but he warned them that the scene inside the house was really unusual. It seemed like the killer, after killing Diane, had sort of been all over the house, clearly taking a lot of time to both clean up and also contaminate the scene to make it harder for investigators. And when Henderson heard this, he sort of raised an eyebrow, because in his experience, most killers tried to get away from the crime scene as quickly as possible. They wouldn't just linger like that. And so at this point, Henderson turned to Minacchio and was like, how do you want to split this up here? And Minacchio said he would stay and interview Diane's parents. That way Henderson could go inside and inspect the rest of the crime scene. Moments later, Henderson stepped through the front door of Diane's house, and he saw the huge amount of blood in the foyer. There was so much that he assumed the murder must have taken place right here in the entryway. There was also a lot of white dust all over the floor that Henderson recognized as fire extinguisher powder. Henderson couldn't see any evidence of a fire, so he guessed that what must have happened here is the killer had sprayed down the area with a fire extinguisher in an effort just to contaminate the scene. Henderson noticed there was a trail of blood that sort of left the entryway and headed towards the back of the house. And so he followed it through the hallway into the kitchen. And in there, he saw forensic techs standing around the kitchen sink, which was full of all the soapy water. And as he walked in, Henderson, one of the techs pulled a woman's wallet out of the sink and then set it open on the counter to dry. Henderson walked over to check the ID and saw that it was Diane's wallet. And so this was obviously very weird, but it got even weirder when the forensics tech reached back into the water and then fished out something else, a TV remote. And so at this point, Henderson and the techs realized that what must be going on here is the killer must have been dumping these items in the soapy water to try to clean off fingerprints or DNA. But after seeing all this, it made Henderson really wonder, what state would the body be in when he found it? If the killer's going to these many lengths with just ancillary evidence, what did they do to the body? And so after chatting with the techs for a few minutes about how strange this whole thing was, Henderson turned and continued following that trail of blood on the ground, and it led him to the door that went down to the basement. And so he looked down into the basement, and he saw at the foot of the stairs there was a forensic specialist taking photos of Diane's body, which was, right at the foot of the stairs. When Henderson went down there and actually got a look at Diane's body, he had been bracing for, her body to be in pretty rough shape, considering what he had seen upstairs, but he was still taken aback by just how violently Diane clearly had been attacked. Her torso, her neck, and her face were covered in literally more stab wounds than he could even count. And then as Henderson leaned in even closer, he saw there were additional bruises on Diane's face and pretty clear defensive marks on her limbs that told him that there had definitely been a pretty big struggle. Also, some of Diane's clothes had been removed, which made Henderson wonder if Diane had been sexually assaulted. And as awful as that obviously is, if that was the case, the upshot was that there was a good chance the killer's DNA could be recovered from her body. However, at the same time Henderson is thinking this, he began to notice a very harsh chemical smell that was clearly coming from Diane's body. And that's when he spotted a bottle of toilet cleaner that was right nearby, and he realized that the killer must have dragged Diane's body down here and then splashed it with chemicals in yet another attempt to destroy evidence. And so at this point, Henderson was getting pretty worried, because the killer clearly had taken a lot of steps to cover their tracks. And if they had done a thorough enough job and the police couldn't find any usable fingerprints or DNA, they'd be relying primarily on witnesses, which are not necessarily hugely reliable. So Henderson just really hoped that was not going to be the case here. But if it was, he just prayed that someone in the neighborhood had seen something. 10 minutes later, Henderson walked down the icy sidewalk, canvassing the neighborhood with his partner, Detective Manacchio. And as they walked, Manacchio filled Henderson in on the talk that he had just had with Diane's parents. What he'd learned was that Diane had recently moved to this neighborhood and that she also dated a lot, mostly men that she met online. And the fact that she dated a lot of people certainly caught Henderson's attention, because all the evidence that they had found so far in Diane's house suggested that she had been killed by somebody she knew. There were no signs of forced entry, and there was evidence of a long, very deliberate cleanup. So the killer had clearly felt comfortable enough to stick around after the murder and had probably known Diane was single, so they were not going to be interrupted. And so Henderson sort of filed these thoughts away as he and his partner arrived at the next house on the block. Henderson knocked, and a moment later, an elderly woman answered the door. And at that point, Henderson explained about Diane's murder, and then he asked her if she had seen anything suspicious around Diane's place the previous day. Cars parked outside, or, strange people coming and going, anything. Now, this woman was immediately startled by the news of a murder in this neighborhood. That definitely was the primary reaction she had. But, she quickly recovered and said that no, she hadn't seen anything. However, she did remember seeing some kids playing in the yard across the street from Diane's, so maybe they had seen something. Moments later, Henderson and Manacchio stood on the front porch of the house that was directly across the street from Diane's, and they were speaking to a woman in her 50s who'd introduced herself as Mrs. Yearwood. When Henderson explained about the murder across the street, Mrs. Yearwood gasped and said that, she hadn't known Diane particularly well. I mean, she was new to the neighborhood, but she had always been so friendly to her and her family. And in fact, Diane had even paid Mrs. Yearwood's son to help with some small chores around her house. At this point, Henderson sort of, shifted the conversation and just got to the point. He told her that he had heard that there had been some kids playing outside this house the previous day. And were the kids home? Because he really wanted to speak to them to see if they had maybe heard or seen anything strange on Diane's property the day before. Mrs. Yearwood immediately nodded and turned around and walked into the back of the house, and then a moment later came back with an 11-year-old boy who looked very nervous. And so Henderson, to disarm him, immediately knelt down and touched him on the shoulder and just said, "Look, we're trying to catch a bad guy." And then Henderson pointed across the street and asked the boy had he seen anything strange at Diane's house the day before. The boy, at this point, looked past Henderson over at Diane's house and then back at Henderson, and he just shook his head and said no. And at this point, Henderson, he felt his stomach sink, because with a deeply contaminated crime scene and apparently no good witnesses, this case was already off to a horrible start. Around noon the following day, December 19th, Detective Henderson sat in his office reading through Diane Zaleski's autopsy report. He'd been anxiously waiting for this file all morning, but unfortunately it did not contain much information that he had not already guessed. Diane's time of death was estimated to be between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m., so 11 to 14 hours before her parents found her body. She had been strangled and beaten and also stabbed more than 40 times. The damage was so severe, the medical examiner couldn't actually say which injury killed her. And also the knife that was used in the attack had never been found. They also couldn't tell if Diane had been sexually assaulted, because the chemicals that had been splashed on her body had destroyed any DNA the killer might have left behind. The forensics team also had not pulled any usable fingerprints from the house, thanks to the killer's cleanup efforts. But they did find something that was even better. There were a few drops of fresh blood at the crime scene that did not match Diane's DNA, and early tests showed that they came from an adult male. Now, it was possible that this blood was from someone other than the killer, but Henderson didn't think so. There had clearly been some sort of struggle between the killer and Diane, so it seemed likely that Diane had managed to wound the killer and maybe draw blood, and maybe this was it. And so now, the game had changed. Henderson's next task would be to collect DNA samples from all the men closest to Diane and compare them to this fresh blood at the crime scene. Now, the digital forensics team had Diane's laptop, and they were working really hard to try to access her online dating profile to try to figure out who she'd been chatting with, because those were definitely some people they might want to compare DNA with. But while Henderson, thought that was great, he wasn't going to wait. He felt like he needed to move on this right now, and he figured if he wanted some answers about who Diane was potentially dating or seeing, or maybe who some of her exes were, he actually knew where he could go to start. Around 9:30 the next morning, Henderson was sitting in a coffee shop across from Diane's best friend, Joanne Govea. Joanne was clearly still processing the murder, and at the moment, she really seemed more angry than anything else. But she told Henderson that she would help any way she could, and that she did know all about the men who were in Diane's life. But of all her romantic partners, there was really only one who concerned her. His name was Mike Prunell, and according to Joanne, he'd been Diane's landlord years ago. After Diane had moved into his building, he'd started showering her with gifts and bugging her to go out with him, and they had ended up dating for a while, but when Diane ended things, Mike had been furious, and Diane had actually had to move to a new place just to get away from him. Now, this obviously got Henderson's attention, and he made a mental note to find Mike as soon as possible. But there was another name that he wanted to ask Joanne about as well. During the search of Diane's house, detectives had found her wallet in the kitchen sink. It had been sitting in the water. And inside of the wallet had been Diane's ID, some credit cards, and then there was also this soggy business card for someone named Mark Baker. And so Henderson asked if Joanne recognized that name. And Joanne said, "Yeah, I do." She said Diane had met Mark Baker at a bar, and they had talked and exchanged contact info, but Joanne didn't know if they'd ever actually followed up. And so Henderson and Joanne spoke for a bit longer, and then eventually they wrapped it up, and Henderson thanked Joanne for the help. And then as he was leaving, he decided that, he really needed to speak to both Mark and Mike, but he would start with Mark because he had his business card. Later that afternoon, Henderson led Mark Baker into the police station's interview room. He offered Mark a seat and a bottle of water, which Mark accepted before asking, what's going on? What is this all about? Mark definitely was pretty annoyed to have been asked to come down here in the middle of the workday with, virtually no explanation. So Henderson decided to just get straight to it. And he explained that he was investigating a murder. Then he pulled out a photo of Diane, put it on the table, and slid it over to Mark. Now, as Henderson did this, he was sort of studying Mark for any sort of reaction when he saw Diane's picture. But Mark just sort of glanced at the photo and then back up at Henderson, and he said, "Am I supposed to know who this is?" And this totally caught Henderson off guard. Henderson told him that the woman's name was Diane, and he knew that Mark had met her at a bar not that long ago. But Mark just shook his head and insisted that that had not happened. He said he definitely didn't know Diane, and he also would not have chatted her up anywhere, because she apparently was not the kind of, quote, target he usually went for. And that word, target, sort of hung in the air very uneasily between them for a long time. And then eventually, Henderson just sort of, cleared his throat and asked if Mark would be willing to give a DNA sample. And Mark flat out refused. But this only made Henderson even more determined to get a sample. Now, he couldn't force it without a warrant, but he had another idea. Mark had been drinking from that water bottle that he had given him when he first came in, and he just hoped if Mark left it behind, Henderson could scoop it up and send it off for testing. So he told Mark that he was free to go. But Henderson was disappointed when Mark did not throw the bottle away. Instead, he put the cap back on, pocketed the bottle, and he left. Now, Henderson obviously couldn't prove this, But just from the looks of it, the decision to take the bottle like that, it felt deliberate. And it reminded him of just how careful Diane's killer had been to remove forensic evidence from the crime scene. So he gave Mark a few seconds head start, and then eventually Henderson got up and actually followed Mark out of the station, but kept his distance so that he wouldn't notice he was behind him. And Henderson very carefully trailed Mark all the way down the block. And then at some point, when Mark stopped and sort of looked around for a moment, Henderson froze until he realized Mark was just checking street signs. And then, Mark just kept on walking and Henderson kept on trailing until eventually Mark pulled out that bottle and he chucked it onto the ground. And then as soon as Mark had walked down the road, turned the corner, and disappeared, Henderson ran over, put on a rubber glove, picked up that bottle, and went right back to the police station. And then as soon as he got there, he put it inside of an evidence bag and he sent it off to the crime lab for testing. That evening, around 6 p.m., Henderson was sitting at his desk, staring at his computer screen in total frustration. He was reading the results of a database search for Diane's ex-boyfriend and former landlord, Mike Purnell, and he was running into a problem. Henderson could not find anybody with that name. A moment later, Henderson heard a knock at his door, and he called for whoever it was to come on in. And then when the door opened, he saw his partner, Detective Minacchio, standing there with a middle-aged man. And Minacchio explained that this guy was Diane's brother, Ron Zaleski, and he was here to give whatever information he could about Diane's personal life. And Henderson immediately perked up because he realized that, Ron very likely knew Diane's ex-boyfriends and any current boyfriends. So as they sat down, Henderson asked him if he remembered a man named Mike Purnell. And Ron immediately paused and looked really surprised, and then said, yeah, he knows exactly who Mike is. Because at one point, Mike had actually asked their father for his blessing to marry Diane. According to Ron, none of the family had been in love with that idea, because Mike had seemed like a really shady guy. In fact, he had such a long rap sheet that he didn't even go by his real name. Two days later, on November 22nd, Detective Henderson sat in the interview room across from the man who called himself Mike Purnell. His real name was Lou Hubbard, and at this point, Henderson knew that amongst his rap sheet was a conviction for domestic violence against his ex-wife. Apparently, he had savagely beaten her, and Henderson knew that obviously in this murder case, Diane had been savagely beaten, so there's, a similarity there. Now, Henderson had not told Lou that they knew his real name, and he also hadn't told Lou why he was even here, and Lou hadn't asked. And at the moment, Lou was just sort of leaning back in his chair, sort of like making light of this whole thing, like it was totally hilarious that he was being held inside of a police station. At some point, Henderson asked Lou where he had been on November 17th, and Lou just sort of shrugged and said he couldn't remember anything about that day, like it didn't stand out at all to him. At this point, Henderson pulled out that photo of Diane and he slid it across the table to Lou. And Lou, he just glanced at it and then slid it back across the table and said he had no idea who that was. And to Henderson, this was just completely unbelievable, like literally not believable, because he knew that Lou had literally proposed to Diane, this woman in the photo. So there was no way he did not recognize her. He had to be lying. At this point, Henderson stood up from the table and he looked at Lou and said, "If you want to keep playing dumb, that's fine." Then he stood up and he walked over to the door, he opened it up, and he yelled out for his partner, Detective Minacchio, to bring him the file on Lou. And then a moment later, Minacchio ran down the hall, he handed over the file, and then Henderson went back to the table. Henderson, calm as could be, opened up the file and then began telling Lou that, "I know your name's not Mike Purnell. It's Lou Hubbard. I know all about you. I know that at one point you were going to propose or did propose to this woman, Diane, the one in the photo, the one you claim not to know. We know all about it. We know about your criminal record, your domestic violence conviction. We know all about it." At this point, Lou's entire demeanor had changed. It was like he knew he'd been caught. And he just nodded and said, yeah, he knows who she is. And he also said that he had seen on TV that she had been murdered, but he swore he didn't do it. Now, Henderson really didn't believe the guy because he's just caught him lying. But he told him, hey, if you really didn't do it, there's an easy way to prove that. Give us a DNA sample, like literally right now. And after a long pause, Lou agreed. Around 8 a.m. the next morning, November 23rd, Detective Henderson was working at his desk when his phone rang. When he looked at the caller ID and he saw the extension, he knew it was the crime lab, and he assumed they must be calling to confirm receipt of Mark Baker and Lou Hubbard's DNA samples they had sent over. But when Henderson answered, the analyst on the line explained they were actually calling with an update from Digital Forensics. The digital team had finally accessed the browsing history on Diane's laptop, and they'd found some activity from the hours after Diane was killed. It looked like the killer, while hanging around inside of Diane's house after the murder, had viewed some pornographic websites, and then they'd also used Diane's credit cards to try and order a MacBook and an iPhone, and they had set the delivery address for these items for Diane's house. Now, Henderson was sort of taken aback by all of this, but what stood out was, well, if they're ordering these items to the scene of the crime, it means they planned on coming back to the scene of the crime. But there was also more. Apparently, the digital forensics team had finally gotten into Diane's dating profile, so now they could see everyone that she had messaged or gone out with in the past. And there were literally dozens and dozens of names. And so when Henderson heard that, he knew that now, there were all these new suspects, dozens of them. They would have to swab and question every one of those men. And so now the case had just totally exploded. Around noon on December 2nd, 2010, so about 2 weeks after Diane's murder, Detective Henderson sat in his car outside of an office building in Newark, New Jersey, watching the front entrance. He'd been there all morning, waiting for a worker whose name was Kyle Porter. Kyle was one of the men that Diane had been messaging with online before she was killed. Henderson had already spoken to him over the phone, and Kyle had actually confirmed that he had been to Diane's house just a few weeks before the murder. But what really made Henderson suspicious of Kyle was just the fact that he had refused to submit a DNA sample, even after Henderson explained that doing so would help clear him as a suspect. So now, as Henderson finally saw Kyle step out of the building and head for the parking lot, Henderson got out of his car and literally ran over to intercept him. And as he did, Henderson flashed his badge, and Kyle for a second looked like he maybe wanted to run, but instead he just sort of stammered that he was going to be late for his lunch meeting, sort of suggesting I can't talk to you right now. But Henderson had not waited around all morning just to leave empty-handed here. So he told Kyle that he could either give a sample right now and be on his way, or they could talk again when Henderson came back with a warrant for Kyle's arrest. And Kyle seemed terrified by that idea, so he sighed and said, "Okay, I'll give you a sample." 4 days later, on the morning of December 6th, Henderson was out jogging before his shift when his cell phone rang. He saw that it was the crime lab calling, so he stopped what he was doing and he answered the call. A forensic analyst from the lab was on the line, and he explained that he was calling because they just finished with the first batch of Henderson's blood samples. This batch included the samples for Mark Baker, the man who Henderson had to secretly trail just to pick up his water bottle, as well as Diane's ex-boyfriend, Lou Hubbard, aka Mike Prunell, and also Kyle Porter, the man she had met through online dating who, only after being threatened with arrest, offered up his DNA swab. And so Henderson held his breath as this analyst read off the results. And not one of them matched the blood sample from the crime scene. For a moment, Henderson thought there really had to be a mistake here, because all three of those men had been so suspicious and so uncooperative. Now, he'd always known that, the crime scene blood that he had tested their samples against maybe wasn't from the killer. But if that was true, then Henderson was really in trouble, because it meant that after all this, he had nothing. Now, the blood from the crime scene had already been tested against the state's DNA bank, and there had been no matches. And now he's got no matches here with these three suspects, and so Henderson knew he really had no choice but to keep finding and testing more suspects. And in the next few weeks and then months, he went through this process over and over, interviewing and obtaining DNA samples from the men in Diane's dating profile history and her email contacts, basically every man who had anything to do with her. He went out and interviewed and tested. In fact, over the next year, the detectives conducted more than 100 interviews and took over 80 DNA samples. But one by one, they all turned into dead ends. One morning in December of 2011, Detective Henderson was at his desk on the phone following up about a tip about Diane's case. So a month earlier, on the anniversary of Diane's death, the local news had aired a big special on the case. And then since then, the police station had been flooded with people calling in various tips. And so now, Henderson and Minacchio had had their hands full following up on all these tips, but so far they had gone nowhere. And so Henderson thanked the person he was on the phone with, even though he sort of knew that what they were telling him was not going to be useful. Then he hung up and let out a frustrated sigh. He was starting to think that he had been totally wrong at the start of this murder, that Diane's killer was not someone she knew, but maybe a random intruder who would be even harder to catch. Or even worse would be, maybe the blood they had been testing all of these suspects against for the last year, that blood maybe didn't even belong to the killer. But just then, Minacchio burst into the office and he had a big grin on his face. And he said he had just gotten a call from this woman who had a story that Henderson needed to hear. Minacchio at this point just handed Henderson his cell phone, and so Henderson put the phone to his ear, and sure enough, there was a woman on the line. And this woman explained that she had an online friend that she spoke with all the time. Now, they'd never actually met in person, but they were still pretty close. And they told each other practically everything. And a few days ago, this online friend of hers had sent a very disturbing message where they openly admitted that they had killed Diane Zaleski. And when this woman told Henderson the actual name of this online friend of hers, he was so confused. But then it was like all at once, the world came crashing down around him, because he realized that over a year ago, on the very first day he'd begun investigating Diane's murder, he had made a huge mistake. Based on forensic evidence from the crime scene and the killer's eventual confession, this is what police believe happened to Diane Zaleski on the night of November 17, 2010. The killer was very nervous as they knocked on Diane's front door, because even though they had been here before, tonight was going to be different. Diane eventually came to the door, and she opened it up, and she seemed sort of surprised to see the killer there. But, she let them inside and asked them, what's going on? What are you doing here? And the killer, they hadn't really figured out how they were going to do this. And at some point, they just sort of blurted out the thing they wanted to tell her, which was to tell Diane that they had really intense feelings about her. But as they were sort of rambling on about all these things they wanted to do with her and how they really just wanted her, Diane stopped them and told them that what they wanted was totally inappropriate and that now they needed to leave. But the killer, after being rejected, refused to leave. And then the killer began to argue. And as they did, they got angrier and angrier until they reached over and grabbed a pair of scissors on the table by the door, and they began stabbing Diane. But Diane, she immediately fought back way harder than the killer had expected, thrashing and kicking until the killer's grip on the scissors slipped. And at that point, the killer actually felt a flash of pain in their hand, and they looked down to see a bloody cut on their hand. But for the killer, this only made them more mad. They tossed the scissors away and then climbed on top of Diane, who's been stabbed repeatedly at this point, but she's still fighting. And the killer switched to just beating her over and over again with their fists. And then when they saw that Diane just wouldn't die, she was still alive on the ground, bleeding profusely, battered but alive. At that point, the killer began to strangle her until finally she stopped moving. Once Diane was still, the killer took their hands off of her and then just sort of looked around at the incredibly bloody mess they'd made in the front of the house. They'd watched enough TV to know that their DNA and fingerprints were probably all over not just Diane's body, but all over the foyer right now. But they also knew that Diane, she lived alone, which meant that nobody was coming home anytime soon, and so they felt like they had plenty of time to clean up this mess. They started by dragging Diane's lifeless body down the hallway to the steps and then down into the basement. And then they cleaned her body with chemicals. And then after that, they went back upstairs and stripped off their own bloody clothes and started a load of laundry. And while they waited for their laundry to be done, the killer just sort of made themselves at home. They took a shower, they watched TV, they cooked and ate a bowl of pasta, and they used Diane's laptop to look at pornography and also do some online shopping with Diane's credit card. And then once the killer's clothes were clean and dry, they put them back on and then collected the items that they had handled, like Diane's wallet and her TV remote, and dumped them in the sink with a bunch of soapy water. Then they went around the house blasting everything with a fire extinguisher from under the sink to destroy trace evidence, and also they went ahead and wiped down the laptop to make sure there was no DNA or fingerprints on that as well. And then finally, sometime in the early hours of the morning after the murder, the killer, after having done all they could, they just casually walked out the door into the falling snow and crossed the street and went into their mother's house. Because the killer was Arnell Yearwood, Diane's neighbor's son. So the huge mistake that investigators made at the very beginning of this investigation was when they found out that the neighbor across the street, Mrs. Yearwood, that her son apparently did chores for Diane. Well, the mistake they made, in particular Detective Henderson, was when Mrs. Yearwood went into the back of the house and came back with that 11-year-old boy that they spoke to that said he didn't see anything strange across the street the day before, they assumed that boy was Mrs. Yearwood's son, and he was the one who was doing chores for Diane. And basically, they're like looking at this kid who's totally innocent, thinking, okay, clearly this kid who's been across the street in her house is not a person of interest. He did not kill anybody. And so the son of Mrs. Yearwood was just sort of forgotten about. What they didn't realize is that 11-year-old boy was not Mrs. Yearwood's son. It was her grandson. Her actual son was a 26-year-old man, Arnell Yearwood, who was actually inside the house on that day. He was hiding in her house. But they just never clarified. They assumed the kid was her son and just sort of wrote off any chance that her son could be involved. And so Detective Henderson and Minacchio didn't put it together until over a year later when they got that tip from that woman who said her online friend confessed to the murder, and his name was Arnell Yearwood. And so ultimately, Diane let Arnell into her house on the night she was killed because she knew and trusted him. He did chores at her house. But he tried to initiate a sexual relationship with her, she rejected him, and so he killed her. Arnell Yearwood was ultimately arrested on April 7th, 2012, so about a year and a half after killing Diane. He would confess to the murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. On the night of June 1st, 2018, 68-year-old Nancy Crampton Brophy sat in bed with her computer on her lap in the home she shared with her husband in the suburb of Beaverton, Oregon. Nancy was trying to work on her newest book, but for some reason, she just couldn't focus on the chapters she was writing. So Nancy was a romance writer who had actually finished 11 novels, and she also ran a blog with some other romance writers who lived in the area. Now, writing really was Nancy's passion, and she'd been doing it her whole life. But despite that, she really had not made any real money from writing. She'd never gotten a legitimate publisher to buy one of her books, so those 11 novels she did, well, they had to be self-published and basically had to be free online for anybody to read them. And so, in order to keep on writing, she had to have a day job to pay the bills. In the past, she'd run a catering company, but now she worked for Medicare. However, despite not having made it big, at least not financially as a writer yet, it didn't deter Nancy. I mean, she was totally motivated to keep on writing because she believed that, the next thing she wrote was going to be the thing that finally made her a bestseller and made her famous and financially stable on her writing. However, tonight, Nancy just felt completely stuck. She could not think of what to write next. So she leaned back into her pillow and just thought about what her character was going through and tried to think if she'd ever gone through anything similar that might inspire, what would need to happen next in the story. So these romance epics that Nancy wrote were very over the top, but she did draw a lot of inspiration from her actual personal life. Most of her work featured very powerful women and had similar themes like freedom and strength and love because Nancy really valued all those things in her own life. The other things all her books had in common was they always had happy endings. And Nancy knew all about happy endings because in some ways, she was living one. Nancy and her husband, Dan Brophy, had been married for almost 25 years. They had both been married before, and Dan actually had a son and granddaughter from his first marriage. And so the fact that Nancy and Dan had found each other after essentially both of them had been living what, felt like very complete lives to that point, felt like another theme that she wrote about all the time, which was this idea of fate. As if fate is the thing that brought Nancy and Dan together. Dan and Nancy even called themselves soulmates, sort of playing on this idea that really fate had led them together. I mean, they had fights and disagreements like any other couple, but they also knew each other so well that sometimes Nancy felt like they could almost read each other's minds, and that sort of got them through any rough patches. And also, another part of the reason that they seemed to work so well together as a couple was because they gave each other plenty of space to pursue their own interests. They were, given freedom, something again that Nancy really valued. And so for Nancy, her sense of freedom, her sense of, being able to pursue what she wanted to, meant shutting herself away every evening in their little attic bedroom for hours and hours to write. And for Dan, his sense of freedom and his ability to pursue his own interests meant working long hours at a career he loved as a chef and a teacher at the Oregon Culinary Institute. Just like Nancy was sort of obsessed with writing, Dan was obsessed with food and cooking. And when he was not in a kitchen, he was often out in the backyard of his and Nancy's house, raising chickens and working in his garden, or maybe on a trip into the Oregon woods to forage for mushrooms. But tonight, despite how happy Nancy's life was and how secure she felt in her own relationship, none of that really mattered relative to what she was trying to do, which was write this book. She just was not able to do it. And as she continued to struggle with writer's block, her mind kind of spiraled off into more sort of pessimistic thinking, and she began thinking about, the money problems that recently had begun to take a toll on both her and Dan. Neither Nancy nor Dan had ever made particularly high salaries, and their finances had always been pretty tight, so that was kind of normal for their relationship. But about 2 years ago, they'd gotten really behind on credit card debt, and that extra debt threw everything else out of whack, and at one point they actually had not even been able to afford their mortgage. Now, realistically, things were actually more under control now. Nancy and Dan had taken a chunk of money from Dan's retirement account to pay off some of this debt, and they'd also made the decision to sell the house they were in now, and downsize, which Nancy actually was kind of excited about. With these lower overhead costs, it would likely mean that she would get to quit her day job and just pursue her passion, writing, and also pursue being the best grandmother she possibly could be. So in a way, things were starting to look up, at least in terms of, their financial situation. But Nancy knew, especially tonight, that she couldn't just forget about the fact that they had these problems. She couldn't just pretend they weren't there. In fact, tonight, the reason Dan was not home when normally he would be is because recently Dan had picked up a second job cooking for an assisted living facility, and he had picked it up to help pay off this debt. So it really was sort of beginning to infect their whole lives, this debt. He was working for a friend of theirs. It was a woman whose name was Tanya Medlin. And the job wasn't bad exactly, but it definitely was not Dan's dream job either. But just then, as Nancy's having all these kind of conflicting and sort of bad thoughts, she heard the front door open and realized that Dan must be home. So she slammed her laptop shut, figured she would attack this later, and she went downstairs to meet him. Nancy got to the front door just as Dan was taking off his boots and coming into the house. And she quickly gave him a kiss and asked how his shift went. But Dan just kind of grunted and said, fine. And then he disappeared into the kitchen to make some food. Dan had always been a pretty gruff person, but to Nancy, it was sort of part of his charm. He was blunt and a little socially awkward, but his love language was food. And so he made her elaborate meals to show her that he cared about her, and she knew that. Nancy did know that other people didn't really understand Dan and often took his mannerisms and gruffness the wrong way. In fact, at the last school where he taught, he'd gotten fired because of his bad attitude. And at the Culinary Institute where he was currently teaching, a group of students had complained that he was way too tough and had impossible standards. Now, Nancy did worry about this. She understood Dan, she knew what he was like. But, the reality here is that if he loses his job or multiple jobs here, they're going to be in a bad spot financially. And again, they have these financial problems that they're working through, but that would be really bad. And then also, on top of that, this was sort of buried in the back of Nancy's mind, is she had this fear that, Dan was going to upset the wrong person. It just seemed like he kind of made people mad everywhere he went, and who knows? A student could snap and try to hurt him. And so maybe it was just the stress kind of coming through as she can't write and they have money problems. But on this night, she just had this feeling of I hope he's going to be okay here. I hope he isn't going to make more people mad and jeopardize his own safety. And so Nancy goes to Dan in the kitchen and she kind of tries to lighten the mood and just ask him how the day went, nothing too crazy. But she noticed that Dan's attitude was really bad. Even by his standards, he was really being quite rude. And Nancy knew that very likely the reason for this is because he had to work the second job because they were in debt. And so Nancy tried to be understanding, but as Dan got grouchier and grouchier over the course of the next few minutes, Nancy just started to feel like he was being rude to her and it was totally unnecessary. And it's like, she's in this with him. Why are you treating me so badly? Eventually, Dan finished making his snack, and it was big enough that he put some on a plate for Nancy as well, and he handed it to her. And this made Nancy smile, even though she was kind of annoyed with Dan. Because it felt like, oh, the old Dan's back. Giving me food is his way of showing me he loves me. And so they ultimately sat down together, and they ate, and they chatted a little bit before Dan said, "I'm tired, I'm going to bed." Just before 5 a.m. the next day, so June 2nd, Nancy woke up to the sound of Dan banging around in their bathroom. Nancy liked to sleep in when she could, and today she could. But Dan, he couldn't, because he had a lot to do that morning, so he was up. That day, he had to go to his school, the Oregon Culinary Institute, to set up the classroom before his students got there, and then also teach that day. And then before that, he also had a list of chores that he did around the house before work, like feeding his chickens. Nancy tried to fall back asleep, but Dan, frankly, was too loud. And at this point, she was kind of back in some negative thought loops and she couldn't sleep. And so she laid there and she began thinking in particular of all the negative thoughts about the book, that she just couldn't continue to write this book. It was like she really had writer's block. And she had not really experienced that in previous novels. This one was just really, really challenging. And so after tossing and turning for a few more minutes, feeling really frustrated, she decided she would just get up and go take a drive and just clear her mind. This was Nancy's go-to. Whenever she needed to work out a storyline or plot hole, she would just hop in her car and drive around and just kind of let her thoughts wander. And this morning, she knew exactly where she wanted to go. She wanted to go to this very beautiful neighborhood with streetcar tracks and tree-lined roads in the nearby city of Portland. So up and out of bed she got. She found Dan in the bathroom and said bye to him, and then she went outside, got in her car, and she was off. Less than 20 minutes later, and Nancy was in Portland. In particular, she was in the neighborhood that she thought was beautiful, and it was this area near a place called Washington Park. And so it's got beautiful foliage, and there's all these beautiful homes, and it's just this wonderful area. And she's driving around, just kind of looking out the window, enjoying herself. And then she had this sort of pang of jealousy, because Dan's school, where he worked, was roughly in this area. And so he got to go through here every morning, and she suddenly felt like, man, I wish I could do that. However, as she continued to drive around Portland, she began to see other sides of the city that she herself did not necessarily think were so great. In particular, she drove through an area where there were all these tents on the streets, where people who were displaced or potentially homeless, that's where they were living. And, they were making the best of it, but from her perspective, this represented danger. And in fact, there'd been a whole lot more drug and criminal activity in this area lately that sort of coincided with more and more of these tents popping up around town. And this had actually really bothered Dan. He was worried about this. However, the way Dan had responded ultimately, beyond just telling Nancy about his concerns, is he had recently started this outreach program where he took extra food from his school and he gave it to a local church to help feed the homeless. Now, Nancy and Dan both thought this was a great idea, and it seemed like, giving back in that way was exactly the right way to respond to what really amounted to a homelessness crisis in the city. But for Nancy, who worried about Dan, she couldn't help but feel like, I kind of wish he wasn't really getting involved. Like, I don't really want him in this part of town. I want him home and safe, or just at his school and safe there. And she just had this growing sense of dread that something was going to happen to Dan. But as Nancy is having seemingly like 10 thoughts all at once in all different directions, she suddenly has an epiphany. She has this moment of absolute clarity about how to write her book. It was like all these elements came together and were showing her the way. And so in an instant, she turned back around and she drove back home to get to work. When Nancy got back to her house, she saw that Dan was already gone, which meant he was off to work at the Culinary Institute, which meant Dan was sort of, back into the dangerous part of town, potentially, surrounded by these homeless people that could potentially harm him. At least that's where her head was going. But she told herself she needed to focus. She needed to just do the writing while she had this moment of clarity. And so she rushes up to her bedroom and she spends the next 2+ hours just writing nonstop. But then at around 10 a.m. that morning, her concentration was broken when her cell phone rang. And when she answered it, she was very surprised to hear one of Dan's colleagues from the Institute on the other line. And the colleague sounded totally frantic, and she told Nancy that Dan was not at the school, and she had heard there was a shooting at the school this morning. And so she was just worried about Dan. She had to make sure he was okay. She said she had tried to call Dan to see what was going on, but he hadn't answered, and so she was hoping that Nancy would know where he was. When Nancy heard this, it was like immediately her mind exploded with all the worst possible case scenarios that could be playing out here. But, she took a deep breath and tried to stay calm, and she told this colleague, although she was not confident this was true, but she told the colleague, likely Dan is just in the middle of a lesson, and that's why he's not picking up his phone. He's probably just fine. The colleague sort of agreed and decided they would sort of wait and see if maybe Dan got back in touch with them. But as soon as Nancy hung up the phone, she threw her laptop aside and ran downstairs and turned on the TV. And as she was flipping through channels looking for the news to find out more about the shooting, she also grabbed her phone and called Dan. But it rang and went to voicemail. So she hung up, she tried it again, but again he didn't answer, and so she texted him. But he didn't text back. At this point, the news was now on the TV, and as Nancy took stock of what she was seeing on the screen, she was horrified. Because it was all these images, from helicopters and from reporters showing Dan's school with all these police and all these news crews outside. I mean, clearly something had happened at the school. And she had just spoken to the colleague who said there was maybe the shooting. And so she raised the volume to see if they would maybe say, was it a shooting? Did somebody get shot? Who got shot? Who did the shooting? What happened? But nobody was saying anything that clarified it, just that something had happened at the school. And so at this point, Nancy couldn't wait any longer. She grabbed her keys, rushed out to her car, and she sped towards Dan's school. Less than 20 minutes later, Nancy drove through that same beautiful neighborhood that she had been in that morning in Portland. But this time, instead of admiring the scenery, she was laser focused on trying to find out if Dan was okay. She was calling and texting him, and she was cycling through the radio to hear any news broadcast about what had actually happened here, to make sure Dan was not involved in it in any way. But at this point, all she had learned from the news was that there really had been a shooting at the Oregon Culinary Institute. But that was it. There was no other information. And so by the time Nancy actually got to the school, she was such a nervous wreck. She was so anxious. She was nauseous. Her hands ached from having white-knuckled the steering wheel on the drive over. I mean, she was a mess. As Nancy looked around, all she saw was the sea of police officers and other first responders, and all this crime scene tape had been put out, and all these reporters. I mean, it was total madness. But in the chaos, and despite her anxiety, Nancy was able to identify a couple of people in this big crowd that she recognized. They were colleagues of Dan's. And so she rushed over to them to ask them questions about where her husband was, what's going on. But as she ran up some stairs to get over to these other colleagues, they saw her coming, and all of them just kind of looked away, like they couldn't look her in the eye. Nancy didn't know what to do, but clearly picked up on the signal, and so instead of talking to them, she turned course and went to the nearest police officer, and she said, "My name is Nancy Crampton Brophy. Dan Brophy is my husband. He works here. I can't get in touch with him. Is he okay?" And as soon as she said this, the officers told her to just wait right here. They'll be right back. And then Nancy, she's standing there as these officers leave, and they come back with these two other men who are wearing dark suits. And those men walk up to her, and they introduce themselves, and they say, "Nancy, we're homicide detectives," and that her husband, Dan Brophy, was the man who was shot on campus, and that he was dead. The next few days went by in a blur for Nancy. She spent basically half her time crying and grieving, and the other half being the person that was sort of in charge of delivering the bad news to friends and colleagues and family about what had happened to Dan. And the reality was, what happened to Dan was still very much up in the air. I mean, the only thing detectives knew at this point was that Dan had been found dead by his students in the kitchen after being shot twice, and that's what killed him. But the school actually didn't have good security camera footage, and so there was no footage to try to indicate who could have come into the classroom and killed him and then left. It was like they didn't really have any good leads, they didn't have any good evidence, and in many ways, it was just this big mystery that didn't appear like it was going to get solved anytime soon. Now, Nancy certainly had her own theory. I mean, she felt like she knew Dan rubbed people the wrong way, and she always had this kind of basic concern that he was going to make the wrong person mad and they were going to just snap and hurt him someday. And that was definitely a worst case scenario. But here she is. Her husband's been killed. He's been shot to death. And so that's what she thought had happened. Maybe it was a student who went crazy and snapped and killed him, or the fact that there was this, burgeoning homeless crisis in Portland and that he was often, or at least recently, interacting with homeless people. And she kind of equated that to being in danger due to the rising drug and criminal activity that was popping up in Portland. And so she had this theory that, basically he had rubbed shoulders with the wrong people and they had killed him over it. She had no way to prove it, but that's what she thought. But instead of really dwelling on what happened to her husband, the reality is over the couple of months following her husband's death, Nancy's life basically fell apart. She wasn't able to focus on anything. It was like her mind had gone blank. It was so traumatic what had happened to her. And so as a result, she couldn't write, so she didn't do any writing. And she also couldn't work. She had to quit her day job because she just could not concentrate on anything. Eventually, Nancy did decide that she would go through and try to sell the house, basically do the plan that she and Dan had thought of to sell it and downsize to get rid of some of this debt. But then she discovered her name was not actually on the deed to the house, and so she couldn't sell it because it technically really wasn't hers. And so now the bank was likely going to foreclose on it because she couldn't afford it. And so again, Nancy's life is just completely upside down. She's totally in debt. She's facing financial ruin. Her husband's been killed. The police have no suspects, no leads. It seems like the case is just going to go cold. And so Nancy just didn't even know what to do. She was surrounded by friends and family that were there to support her, but there was nothing that anybody could reasonably do to lift her out of this horrible situation she was in. Fast forward to September 5th, so 2 months after Dan had been killed. And Nancy was on her way back to her house, the house that she still couldn't sell, and she had by this point sold a lot of stuff inside of the house just to pay the bills. And she still wasn't working, and she had tried writing a little bit, but still it was like her mind was just blank at this point from all the trauma. And she's on her way home from some errands, and she pulls into the driveway, and as she gets out of her car, she hears another car pull in behind her, and she turns and she sees it's a police cruiser. Now, she had had several interactions with police pretty much immediately following the death of her husband, but for the most part, she didn't really see police officers all that often. And so these two detectives get out of the vehicle and they walk up to Nancy. And so Nancy, she's looking at them expectantly, like clearly this has to do with Dan. Why else would you be here? But she's wondering, maybe there was a break in the case. Maybe there's a promising new lead, or they just want to talk to her. She didn't know, but she just stood there and they walked up to her and they told her that there has been a huge break in the case. They found something on the internet that points to exactly who Dan's killer is. It would turn out Dan's killer had actually confessed to their crime on the internet more than a decade before it happened. The killer literally wrote about how all they think about is murder, and that you have to be organized and ruthless and very clever to commit murder, and that, the thing they know about murder is that everybody has it in them if they're pushed far enough. But the most damning thing about the confession was that the killer posted it on a romance blog under the title, How to Murder Your Husband. Dan's killer was his own wife, Nancy. After she wrote that blog post, Nancy would spend the next 10 plus years writing romantic thrillers about powerful women who fell in love and then murdered their enemies. Now, to be clear, Nancy really did love Dan, and she did think they had this beautiful life together. But Nancy ultimately loved writing more than she loved Dan. And so ultimately, Nancy killed Dan basically to, one, live out the sort of fantasy that she played out in all of her novels about these powerful women killing their enemies. And, Dan was not her enemy, but he sort of represented a hurdle between her and the life she wanted, which was to be a writer full-time, which meant she needed more money. And if she killed Dan and got rid of him, she could collect on his life insurance policies and fund the lifestyle that she wanted. And so in a way, there was a parallel there. And so she was able to literally live out a fantasy and also finance this lifestyle that she dreamed of, to be a writer. And so on that day that Nancy was driving around Portland, clearing her mind to think about what she was going to write, she really was doing that. But then she realized her big solve was just go shoot Dan to death in his school, and all your problems are solved. But because Nancy had done all this writing in the years leading up to the crime, about how to kill your husband. That was a central theme in a lot of her writing. It made her look really suspicious, and they brought that to Nancy, and quickly, her story fell apart, and she was found guilty. Nancy was ultimately sentenced to life in prison for the murder. In 1990, 31-year-old John O'Brien was a landscaper in a town just outside of Chicago, Illinois. In January of that year, he and his friend David decided they wanted to escape the cold Chicago winter and go on some vacation to somewhere nice and warm. And so they decided to book a trip to the very sunny Caribbean islands of Trinidad and Tobago. They left for their trip just a couple of days later, which was believed to be January 8th or January 9th, and the hotel they were staying in was right near the airport in Trinidad. So they land in Trinidad, they get off their plane, they make their way out of the airport, they go to their hotel, they drop their luggage, and then they headed out to explore the town. And over the next couple of days, they not only explored Trinidad, but also the island of Tobago, which was a 4-hour boat ride away. And they had great food, they saw some really cool attractions, and just overall, they had a chance to relax in the warm weather while all their friends back home were freezing in Chicago. And so, by all accounts, their vacation was going exactly to plan until Sunday, the 14th of January. This was the day before they were supposed to fly back to Chicago. That day, John began complaining of some unnamed health issue, which has not been made public, so we don't know what it is, and he went to some drugstore in town in Trinidad to look for a specific medication for this unnamed health issue. But the drugstore did not carry this medication, so John left and he went to another drugstore and another store, but nobody had this medication. And so by the time John got back to the hotel and saw David would later remark that John was not only distraught about not having this medication, but John was disoriented. Like whatever this health issue was, it was starting to manifest itself in this kind of disoriented state that John was in because it was not being treated. But eventually, David decided that John was okay enough that they did not need to call a hospital or call a doctor, and the two men decided to just go to bed because after all, they had a very early flight the next morning. So the two men climb into their respective beds, which are in the same room, 2 twin-size beds, and they fall asleep. But about an hour to maybe an hour and a half after David had fallen asleep, he wakes up to some man standing next to his bed, choking him. He's grabbing his throat and throttling him. And so David has no time to respond to what's going on. He just starts grabbing this guy's hands and he manages to push them off of him. And then this guy who's standing next to his bed grabs the lamp next to him and smashes David with it. David, from getting hit, falls out of the bed. He lands on the ground, and this guy, his attacker, jumps on top of him, and the two men are fighting, but eventually David manages to overpower this guy and he kicks him off. And as soon as he does that, he realizes this guy that's been attacking him is John, and John is completely naked. He's got no clothes on. And so John just stands up and David's looking at him like, what's going on? And John just runs out of the hotel room. He ends up running down the hall. He goes down the stairs. He runs past the front desk, out the front doors of the hotel, and just takes off running. And so John runs for several minutes until he reaches the airport, but instead of going through the front gates, he goes to the side of the front gates where there are these huge chain link fences with barbed wire at the top. And John, again wearing no clothes, climbs up the chain link fence and then manages to navigate the barbs at the top and drops over onto the other side. But where he landed, although it was on airport property, it was kind of like a trap because this airport had 2 fences around its perimeter back to back. And so where John landed was like this grassy no man's land between these 2 fences. But John was on this kind of deranged mission, so he stands up and instead of trying to get back out again, he turns and climbs the next fence, the one that is closer to the airport. And so he climbs up this fence, he manages to get past all the barbed wire at the top, and he drops into the parking lot on the other side. He stands up and just continues running towards the main building of the airport. But between him and the main building of this airport is this huge concrete wall that doesn't look like it has any place to grab onto to climb over it. But John runs up to this wall and manages to climb up and over the wall. And where he landed on the other side was right next to this security guard shack. And so he comes crashing down, and the 4 security guards that are in this shack, they see him come over the wall. They see this naked guy just suddenly appear, and so they charge out to apprehend him and figure out what's going on. But John apparently attacked them. We don't know exactly what he did, but he managed to overpower all 4 of them, and he stole their 4-wheel drive vehicle. And so John just bombs away from the security guard shack with the 4 security guards chasing him on foot. And John, he weaves around the outside of the main airport building, and he heads out onto the tarmac. Out on the tarmac, there were several planes that were moving into position for takeoff. One of those planes was this huge British Airways jet airliner passenger plane that was actually the next to take off. They'd already fired up their engines, and they were sitting at the top of the runway just waiting for clearance. And John just drives directly into this plane. But the vehicle he was driving, this little 4-wheel drive vehicle, it was not tall enough to actually strike the main body of this plane. So instead, when he hit this plane, he basically got wedged underneath one of the wings. At this point, the 4 security guards that had been attacked and had their vehicle stolen from them, I mean, they're running towards the tarmac, but they've also alerted other security personnel in the airport who are all streaming out onto the tarmac towards this British Airways plane and this vehicle and John. And so as they are descending on the scene, the security guards would see John from the passenger seat of this 4-wheel drive vehicle. He stands up, and they can see he's got a pretty nasty cut on his shoulder. And John reaches up and starts rubbing his hand on the underside of the plane, which had been damaged from running into it. And there was oil leaking off the underside of this plane, and John began rubbing this oil around and then dabbing it into his big wound on his shoulder. And then after packing it with this oil, John leapt out of the wrecked 4-wheel drive vehicle and then just took off running away from all these security guards and away from this plane. And in the chaos of this moment, all these security guards and all the airport personnel that were descending on this scene, they managed to lose sight of John. He disappeared on the backside of this plane. And so all these security guards and airport personnel, they come to a stop about 100 feet away from this plane and this wrecked vehicle, and they're just kind of staring at it, wondering, what are we going to do next? They're calling other agencies to come in and assist with this situation, when all of a sudden, somebody notices John about 300 feet away on the other side of the plane. He comes out from behind a building. And so he's running towards the plane, he's running towards this wall of security guards and other airport staff, and John, he manages to get all the way up to the plane before anybody can come up and apprehend him. And when he reaches the plane, he stops for a second, looks up at the engine of this airplane that's still spinning. It's been turned on, and John jumps into the engine, and instantaneously John ceases to exist. He is completely decimated. No one knows for sure what actually caused John's rampage, although it's assumed it had to do with whatever this unnamed health issue was. Ultimately, his death was ruled a suicide. One of the most dangerous Olympic sports is called luge. In a nutshell, 1 or 2 people who are called lugers will ride a sled down a hill as fast as they can. But this hill is this narrow, winding, banked ice track, and these lugers will ride a sled that will go as fast as 80 miles per hour or faster. While accidents in luging are actually quite uncommon, when they do occur, they can be catastrophic. In 1986, a luge track was built on a ski hill in Alberta, Canada, for the luge event of the 1988 Winter Olympics. This track and the surrounding ski area was called Canada Olympic Park. After the Olympics were over, this park was open to the public for recreational purposes. Nearly 30 years later, on January 29, 2016, 3 teenage boys snuck into Canada Olympic Park after hours. They made their way up the hill until they reached this blue 6-foot-tall fence that was covered with warnings telling people to stay back and don't go past this fence unless you are authorized personnel, and these 3 teenage boys were not authorized personnel. Inside of this 6-foot-tall blue fence, entrance was what looked like this tall flight of stairs that led up to what looked almost like a log cabin. And that cabin was the starting house of the luge track. The track literally came out of the cabin and fed down below. The three boys, one of which had actually worked at this park the winter before selling tickets, they looked at each other and grinned and then chucked their plastic sleds over this blue fence, and then they climbed up and over themselves. Once on the other side, they each picked up their sled and then made their way up the stairs into the starting house. Once they were inside, they kind of arranged themselves to see who would go first, second, and third. They put their helmets on because they all brought helmets. They strapped on headlamps so they could see the course because there were no lights on the course. And then one by one, they began going down this luge track. But surprisingly, it wasn't that fast. As they went down, they would actually stop and have to use their feet to get going again. But that was because they had these cheap plastic sleds that were not designed for this luge course. What you needed were these specialty sleds with blades on the sides that got you up to full speed. And so after the three boys eventually, slowly, painfully made their way all the way down to the bottom of this luge track, they were pretty disappointed, but they thought, okay, well, let's just all get in one sled and we'll go down again, and with the added weight, we should go faster. And so they marched their way back up, all the way up to the top of the starting house, and all three of them sat in one sled and they pushed off, and sure enough, they went way faster. They bombed all the way down this track. It was so much fun. They were totally exhilarated, and after doing it a couple more times, they decided, okay, our luck's gonna run out, we're gonna get caught, and so they climbed back over that blue fence and snuck out of the park without getting caught. The following weekend, those three same boys, along with 5 of their friends they had recruited, returned to Canada Olympic Park after hours. And so the 3 boys that had been there the weekend before, they led the group up the hill. They got to that blue fence that surrounded the luge starting house, and one by one, each of these teenage boys climbed up and over this fence, and they made their way up the stairs into the starting house. Once they were inside, they began figuring out who was going to go in each of the 3 sleds they had brought along. And they determined they would put 3 boys in the first sled, 3 boys in the second sled, and 2 boys in the final sled. Because of how successful the previous weekend's trip down the luge track had been, according to the 3 boys that had gone, this time the group decided they did not need helmets because this was relatively safe. They also decided not to bring headlamps because they figured it would be more exhilarating to go flying down this track in the darkness. And so a little after midnight on February 6th, the first 3 boys climbed into the first sled and pushed off. At first, it was going exactly to plan. It was fun, they were going fast, it was exhilarating, but then disaster struck. Unlike the previous weekend, this weekend, there was a metal chain that had been strung across one of the sections towards the bottom of the luge track. It was there to keep a particular section of the track in place. And so these boys, as they come flying around the corner, they don't see it, and they strike this chain at full speed. Now, this chain was at neck height, and so when it hit them, it instantly decapitated and killed one of the boys. It was a 17-year-old named Evan Caldwell. And so he dies immediately, and the other 2 are thrown from the sled and landed unconscious. Now, back up at the starting house, they have no way of knowing this has happened to the first sled. Not only because they can't see anything, but also because the boys in the first sled are not making any sound. They're either unconscious or deceased. And so at some point, this second group of boys thinks they've waited long enough to account for the first sled to get down and out of the way. And so they load up their sled and they push off. And so they go flying down, it's going great, but just like the first sled, at some point they turn that corner and they hit that chain. But miraculously, the second group of 3 boys, they hit the chain in such a way that they kind of slipped under it. And so they were all thrown from their sled and kind of smashed into the track. But the worst injury of the second sled was just a broken ankle. And so this group, they stand up and they're totally disoriented. It's dark. They don't know what they just ran into. And before they had a chance to kind of collect their thoughts and yell up to the starting house to try to warn the third and final group not to go, it was already too late. All the boys could do in the second sled group was to just get out of the way as the third and final sled carrying the final 2 boys came bombing down, and they too struck that chain at full speed. One of the 2 boys on board this third and final sled was a 17-year-old named Jordan Caldwell, and he too, unfortunately, would be decapitated by the chain and would die instantly. And he was actually the twin brother of Evan Caldwell, the boy on the first sled sled who had also died. The other boy on the third sled would be thrown from the sled and would suffer grievous injuries as well. One of the survivors of the crash, who was actually on the first sled, his name was Caleb, and he was knocked unconscious from being thrown. When he came to, he was laying in a section of the track that was covered by a tarp, and at first he couldn't see anything, he couldn't hear anything, but he just felt like there was something lodged in his throat, and it was making it very hard to breathe. Most likely that was just from his throat being crushed in from hitting that chain. And so as he's struggling to breathe, his senses began to come back to him, and his sight came back, and he noticed he was laying down, and one of the boys who had been on the second sled was kneeling next to him. This was one of the boys that had not been badly hurt, and he had his hand on Caleb's shoulder, and he was praying for Caleb to survive. And so as Caleb is taking in that someone is praying over him, he notices somewhere else. His hearing is starting to pick up. He can hear someone else, and it would turn out to be a boy named Mark, who was on the first sled, who had been very badly injured. His face was very badly beaten up. He was laying somewhere nearby, and he was just singing this religious song. He was trying to keep spirits high, and he was trying to will people to hold on and to survive as long as they possibly could. And then Caleb remembered hearing someone calling 911, and then he doesn't remember what happened next. When the paramedics ultimately arrived within the hour, they got to the track and they found all of these boys spread out all over the track, because when they hit this chain, they got sent flying. But they discovered the twins were actually laying right next to each other, and none of these surviving boys had moved their bodies. And so even though the grief was just unfathomable amongst this family that had lost their two sons, there was some solace in the fact that despite having come down in different sleds, that the twins, Evan and Jordan, were together in their final moments. The 6 survivors of this accident would walk away from it with life-changing head injuries and other medical issues, and they would walk away with an indescribable sense of guilt and regret. But they consider themselves lucky because at least they survived. IQ, which stands for intelligence quotient, is a measure of someone's intelligence. To find your IQ, you need to take an official IQ test, which gives you an IQ score. The vast majority of people will score about 100 as their IQ, and so that's considered to be the average intelligence for any given person. But a very small number of people will score somewhere between 130 and 160. And so that's considered to be a very high IQ. Those are very, very gifted people. And then there is an even smaller group of people that score above 160. And so that is the genius class. Anybody who scores above 160 is literally a genius. To give you a sense of just how rare that is, Albert Einstein, who is largely considered to be one of the smartest people to have ever lived, he was not even considered a genius, at least not by his IQ. He was about 160, so right on the cusp of geniusness. But as we will learn from this story, having an exceptionally high IQ does not make you immune to making unfathomably bad choices. In 1991, 31-year-old Jackie Katarik, who had a genius IQ of 170, so she was smarter than Albert Einstein, she graduated from UCLA Medical School with honors. She completed her medical residency, which is like a multi-year apprenticeship for new doctors, at Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles, which is one of the very best hospitals in America. After that, she opened her very own practice just north of LA in a town called Bakersfield, California, and she also became a part-time professor at her alma mater, UCLA. By all accounts, Jackie was brilliant, she was successful, and she loved what she did, and her patients and her students loved her right back. Fast forward to 2010, Jackie was 49 years old, and she was still running her very successful practice, and she was still teaching at UCLA, and she was in an on-again, off-again relationship with a 58-year-old man named William Moody. While the details of their relationship are not really publicly known, it's fairly easy to deduce from the reporting that came from this case that Jackie and William fought a lot. On Wednesday, August 25th of that year, Jackie was spotted by herself at a Mediterranean restaurant in Bakersfield, California, having some drinks. And then at some point during the night, she called a ride service to pick her up and take her home again. Even though we don't know this for sure, it's assumed she was too intoxicated to drive, and that's why she called the ride service. The following morning, Jackie did not show up for work. Her assistant at her medical practice is the one who noticed Jackie had not shown up. And so when she didn't, she called her boss, but her boss didn't pick up. And so after a couple of failed attempts at getting in touch with Jackie, this assistant called Jackie's boyfriend, William. And so William, he picks up the phone, and when the assistant asks him, hey, have you seen Jackie? She has not come into work today. William actually says, yes, I saw her last night. William would explain to the assistant that the night before he was in his house by himself in Bakersfield, California, not far from this restaurant where Jackie was last seen. And he said that at some point, unannounced, he saw Jackie pull up in front of his house. And so he could tell from her general demeanor and her look and her pace that she was upset about something, or he just sensed there was going to be some conflict if he went to the door. And so he decided to actually slip out the back door and kind of run away from his property before Jackie could see him. And so he actually left the property and went to a friend's house who was nearby and spent the night with this friend. And so when the assistant called William, William was actually still at this friend's house. He had not been back to his actual property. And so he would tell the assistant that, the last I saw of Jackie, it was late at night. She had pulled up in front of my house, but then I split. So I don't know what she did. I assume she left. But William would tell the assistant that, I'll go back over to my house and I'll see if she's still there or if there's some indication of where she might have gone. And so William hangs up the phone, he leaves his friend's house and walks the couple of blocks back to his own property. And when he gets there, sure enough, right out front of his house is Jackie's car. Now, William knew his house was locked and Jackie didn't have a key. And so Jackie must just be sitting in her car waiting for him to return. And so William walks up to the car expecting to see Jackie and expecting probably to fight about something. But when he gets up to the car, Jackie's not in there, but her purse, her cell phone, her wallet, that's all over the inside of the car. And so William turns and looks at his house thinking, is she in the house? Did she somehow get in? Is she on the back of the house? And so William just starts yelling out for Jackie as he begins to walk around his house. And so as he goes around towards the back of the house, he's yelling out for Jackie. No one's calling back. And then he reaches the back of the house and there's no sign of Jackie, but he sees there's a shovel on the ground near his back door. And then he looks at his back door and it looks very obviously like someone, probably Jackie, had been using the shovel to try to pry open the back door. Like they were trying to break in, but it hadn't worked. And so William just kind of sees that and then continues walking around the other side of the house. So he's completely walked around the entire property. There's no sign of Jackie. And so he's thinking, okay, I guess she must have gotten in somehow. She's in the house somewhere. And so William goes to the front door. He unlocks his front door. He goes inside. And even though he knows all of his doors have been locked, all the windows are locked, he's kind of on edge because he's thinking she's got to be in here. But he walks through his house and there's no sign of Jackie. And there's no sign that anybody else had been in there since he was last in there. And so he's totally puzzled because it doesn't really make any sense that Jackie's car is out front, but he's thinking, okay, maybe she got here and then she called a ride service and went somewhere else. I'm sure she's fine. So William calls the medical assistant and says, look, her car is here, her stuff's here, but she's not here. I don't know what she's doing. I'll let you know if anything comes of it. The assistant said, I really feel like something's off here and we really do need to call the police. And so William would say, you know what? I think that's a good idea too. Let's just get them involved and make sure she's okay. And so they call the police, and the police start by going to Jackie's residence. But Jackie's not there and there's no sign of her. The neighbors haven't seen her. And so the police go to William's household and they search Jackie's car and they search William's house and the surrounding area right outside. But there's really no clues as to what actually happened to Jackie. And so after the police talked to a bunch of neighbors and friends and family, they just told William and this medical assistant that at this point, they just need to wait and that hopefully Jackie will just come out of wherever it is she's hiding or wherever she's gone. Maybe she's upset. Maybe she was fighting with William and she's run off somewhere, but we just gotta wait and see what happens. 2 days later, Jackie was still unaccounted for. No one knew where she was. No one had heard from her. No one had seen her when William's friend went over to his house. William, the day before, so 24 hours after Jackie had been reported missing, he had left the country on a prearranged trip. But he was not being looked at as a potential suspect or having anything to do with Jackie's disappearance, and so he was allowed to go. And so this friend had been asked to go to his property to feed his fish. And so he shows up on Saturday, that's 48 hours after Jackie has been reported missing. He goes inside the house, and immediately he is hit with this terrible smell inside of William's house. And so he's covering his face, and he's walking around the house trying to figure out where the smell is coming from. He thinks it could be the fridge, maybe something's rotting that's fallen out, or the door's open or something, but it's not the fridge. He goes to the trash, it's not the trash. He goes to the fish, it's not the fish. He makes his way over to the fireplace, and he realizes that's where the smell is coming from. And so kind of reluctantly, he gets down and he kind of smells inside the fireplace, but it's not really coming from the area where the logs would be. It's coming from up in the chimney flue. And so he puts his head down and kind of turns and looks up the chimney, and about 2 feet up the flue, dangling down, are 2 human legs. And they would be Jackie's legs. It would turn out a few days earlier, when Jackie was at that restaurant drinking by herself, she did call that ride service to come give her a ride home, presumably because she was too intoxicated to drive. But before they showed up, Jackie just got into her car anyways and drove to her estranged boyfriend's house. And so she gets there. William, meanwhile, is sneaking out the back and running off to his friend's house. Jackie does not see him. She makes her way up to the front door and presumably tries to knock and get William's attention. But when no attention is given to her and it seems like no one's inside, she decides she's going to try to get into the house. And so the front door was locked, the windows were all locked. She got to the back door and that was locked. So she tried the shovel and tried to pry it open, but it didn't work. And so eventually Jackie climbed up the permanent ladder that's on the back of the house. There isn't much online describing this permanent ladder. It could be a fire escape or it could be some sort of lawn decoration, but there was something on the back of the house that you could climb up if you wanted to. And so Jackie climbed up this permanent ladder and actually got onto the roof. And then when she was on the roof, she walked to the center where the chimney was, and there was this cap over the top of the chimney to prevent things from going into the chimney. She removed the cap and then lowered herself feet first into this chimney. Now, it's unclear how quickly she descended this chimney, but eventually she got stuck because the width of this chimney was not uniform. It started fairly wide at the top and then narrowed as it went down. And so at some point, as she went down feet first, she would have gotten completely wedged. It wouldn't have mattered if her hands were above her head or by her side, because either way, they were useless. She couldn't bend her arms and there was nothing to grab onto, so her arms couldn't do anything. And then below her, there was nothing for her feet to push onto. And so she was totally stuck. And since William was not in his house, he had left, there was no one there to help her. And so Jackie probably started screaming for help, but as soon as she did that and she exhaled that huge scream, her chest would have constricted from exhaling, and that would have shrunk her chest, making her thinner, and she would have dropped a little bit farther into the chimney. And then when she breathed back in again, her chest would not be able to expand back to its original position because the chimney would be restricting her. It's like this brace that's around her chest that as she gets lower and lower and lower, it gets tighter and tighter and tighter. And so her lung capacity is shrinking second by second. And as her lung capacity shrinks, she would not have had the lung strength to emit a loud enough sound to get anybody's attention. Basically, she couldn't scream. She couldn't take in a big enough breath to scream out. And so she was just stuck in this totally compromised position in this claustrophobic little chimney where she could do nothing but wait and hope maybe William or someone took notice of the fact that she was in here, even though, again, she couldn't get anyone's attention. And so most likely she would have begun rationing her breaths because, again, every time she breathes out too much, she goes farther and farther, making it harder and harder to breathe. And at some point, starting on Thursday night, she would have heard William in the house. He would have been only a few feet away from her, but she can't make a sound loud enough to get his attention. And we know she was alive by Thursday night because neighbors heard someone faintly yelling help on Friday night. So nearly 48 hours after she got stuck in the chimney, it's believed she was still alive. And those neighbors, when they heard that faint call for help, they assumed it was kids in a nearby pool, and so they didn't do anything about it. When they found out what had happened, they thought, you know what, it it was coming from that chimney. That's where we heard it coming from. Jackie would die shortly after the neighbors heard her calling for help, because she was dead by the time the friend found her in the chimney the following day on Saturday. Jackie would die from mechanical asphyxia, which is basically suffocation, but it's caused by some physical obstruction. And in this case, it was the chimney. The chimney literally crushed her chest to the point where she could no longer inflate her lungs. It would take firefighters approximately 5 hours to break this chimney down to finally retrieve Jackie's body. No charges were filed against anyone for Jackie's death. It was ruled to be an accident caused by an unbelievable error in judgment by an unbelievably brilliant woman. The United States formally entered World War II on December 8th, 1941, after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. At the time, Joseph Byerly was a senior at his high school in Muskegon, Michigan, and he had a scholarship to attend Notre Dame University the next year. But after his graduation in 1942, he decided he didn't want to go to college so long as other kids his age were going off to fight the war. And so he enlisted in the Army, and he immediately volunteered for one of the most dangerous units, the parachute infantry. Joseph completed a brutal accelerated training regimen that included exhausting PT in blistering heat, extended forced marches, grueling full kit runs up mountains, as well as both American and British jump schools. By 1943, Joseph was fully trained and stationed in England and was eager to put his training to the test. But the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France, also known as D-Day, was still a few months away. But Joseph didn't want to wait that long, so he volunteered for an incredibly dangerous mission that the OSS was recruiting paratroopers for. The OSS was the predecessor to the CIA. Basically, volunteers would parachute in the middle of the night into Nazi-occupied France with a backpack full of gold. Once they hit the ground, they'd meet up with the French resistance and give the gold to them, and then the resistance would do their best to protect these volunteer paratroopers and hopefully give them a ride back out to England. But by no means was it a guarantee, because many of these volunteers were killed in the process. This was some hardcore, deep cover spy work that the OSS would tell their volunteers, if you get caught on this mission, you're gonna get tortured and you're gonna get executed. Joseph would successfully complete this insane mission, and then he liked it so much, he did it again. Shortly after his second successful OSS mission, word came down that D-Day was set to take place on June 6th. Joseph's unit was told they were going to be parachuted into France the night before in order to destroy bridges, cut power supply lines, and generally soften up defenses before the main invasion happened just a couple of hours later at Utah Beach. So in the dead of night on June 5th, Joseph and his unit were flying over France when they were struck by enemy fire. And so as their plane is literally falling to the ground, Joseph leaps out the door when he's only 400 feet off the ground, and he manages to survive the jump, his parachute inflated just in time, but he landed on top of a church where a Nazi sniper was up in the steeple taking shots at all of the other paratroopers. And when the sniper saw Joseph on the roof, he began taking shots at him, and Joseph managed to dodge the rounds before slipping off the roof and running out of sight. Once on the ground, he slammed a mag into his M1 carbine and then began a one-man mission so incredible that there is a plaque inside of the church he landed on that looks like this. Completely alone, with no idea where the rest of his unit was, Joseph took off running from the church and once again had to dodge more sniper fire, and he eventually made it to the town's power substation, which he blew up with thermite. So he cut the power to the town, and from there he went building to building to building, killing every Nazi he came across, including an entire squad of Nazi infantry that he ambushed with grenades. At some point, Joseph made his way over to one of the bridges leading into this town that if he blew up, it would prevent Nazis from sending reinforcements to Utah Beach. But as he crawled through one of the hedgerows, he fell headfirst into a Nazi machine gun nest, and when he turned around, there were a bunch of machine guns pointed at his face, and so he surrendered. Joseph was marched deeper into France to a POW holding area, and as soon as he got there, explosions ripped out all around him. It wasn't clear if it was German artillery or American aircraft, but whatever it was killing both Germans and American POWs. Joseph took shrapnel to the leg and was blown into a ditch, and despite being in excruciating pain, he took this as an opportunity to escape. And so he got up and ran away as best as he could with his injury, and for 12 hours he remained uncaught behind enemy lines before he was ultimately caught again. This time they put Joseph in the back of a covered locked truck to keep him from escaping, and they decided they would send him to St. Lo and decide what to do with him there. But on their transit to St. Lo, an Allied aircraft strafed the vehicle that Joseph was in, and Joseph survived the attack and was able to leap out of one of the holes in the side of the truck from this attack, and he attempted to escape. But once again, he was caught. The Nazis finally got Joseph to St. Lo, and as soon as they got there, the Americans launched an all-night bombing campaign on the city. But once again, Joseph narrowly survives. A recurring theme of Joseph's story is that he is repeatedly almost killed by his own teammates. For the next few days, Joseph was interrogated 20 to 24 hours a day, but he didn't give them any information, and he repeatedly called them sons of bitches until they got so fed up with him, they just beat him to a pulp, and he was knocked unconscious and kept in the hospital for several days. For the next 3 months, Joseph was starved, beaten, interrogated some more, and moved to multiple POW camps. He'd be forced to do back-breaking labor all day. At night, he would survive Allied bombing runs, and he would constantly weather hunger, disease, and exhaustion. At one point, he was locked inside of this boxcar with 50 other guys. He could barely move inside of it, and once again, it was strafed by Allied planes, and he was one of the very few people to survive that. In September of 1944, Joseph was moved to a Russian POW camp in Poland that held about 12,000 Russian men and women POWs. And as soon as he got there, he immediately began planning his escape. 2 months later, on a freezing night in November, Joseph, along with 3 other American POWs, managed to cut the barbed wire and snuck out of the camp and began making their escape south. They snuck into a railway station and hopped on a train car they believed was headed for Poland. Their plan was to meet up with the Soviet Red Army as it pushed through the region. But unfortunately, they got on the wrong train and they wound up in Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany. One thing you don't hear much about when it comes to World War II is there was actually a large number of Germans that hated Hitler and totally disagreed with the Nazis. And so they organized a German underground resistance that was designed to help the Allies during the war. And so when Joseph and the other 3 American POWs arrived in Berlin, still wearing their POW uniforms, a member of the German resistance saw them and immediately grabbed them and brought them into hiding. But after only a week, the infamous Nazi secret police, aka the Gestapo, discovered them and arrested them. Over the next 10 days, Joseph and the other American POWs got to see firsthand just how awful the Gestapo really were. They were constantly interrogated while they were beaten, kicked, walked on, strung up by their arms backwards. They were hit with whips, clubs, and rifle butts until they drifted into unconsciousness. And then as soon as they started to come to, it would start all over again. After those 10 days, the Gestapo turned Joseph and the other 3 American POWs over to the German army, who put them in the brutal prison camp called the Stalag Luft III. Upon arrival, Joseph was immediately sentenced to 30 days inside of a 4 by 5 foot pine box that was too small to stand up or lay down in. Fortunately for him, he only had to endure 7 days because a Red Cross operative from Geneva intervened on his behalf. It would take months for Joseph to get his strength back after being inside of this box, but as soon as he did, he began plotting his next escape. One night, Joseph, along with his 3 American POW buddies, managed to break through a prison wall and made a mad dash for freedom, but the Nazi prison guards saw it and opened fire on them. All 3 of Joseph's friends were killed as they ran, but Joseph got away, only to hear the faint barking of the German shepherds the Nazis had sent to hunt him down. So in the freezing cold of Poland in January, Joseph leapt headfirst into a partially frozen river and swam over 2 miles down it before getting out and running blindly into the woods. Somehow, miraculously, he managed to reach Soviet lines before he froze to death. And there, he spoke with battalion commander Alexandra Samosenko, a woman who holds the distinction of being the only female tank commander in all of World War II. Even though Joseph spoke very little Russian, he convinced her to let him join her unit. And so she gave him a gun and some ammunition, and she told him what their next objective was. They were going to liberate the same POW camp he had just escaped from. And so Joseph, alongside the Soviet Red Army that he now fought for, turn around and go smash this POW camp. And after the dust had settled, Joseph raided the main camp office and stole his defiant official POW photo that the Germans had taken of him on the first day he got captured. Joseph continued to fight alongside the Soviets across the Eastern Front for a couple of months, but when a German dive bomber blew up the tank that Joseph was riding on, he was evacuated to a Russian field hospital. There, he received a visit from Georgy Zhukov, the most important Soviet military commander in World War II, who was intrigued by the only non-Soviet in the hospital. He sat with Joseph and learned his story through an interpreter, and then afterwards he provided Joseph with official paperwork that would allow him to rejoin American forces. And so in February of 1945, Joseph was sent to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, but unfortunately, when he finally met a friendly American face, after nearly a year of fighting behind enemy lines, they didn't believe his story. They told him that Joseph R. Byerly had been killed in action on June 10th, 1944, and that they had already had a funeral mass in his honor in Muskegon, and that his obituary had already been printed in the paper. But despite Joseph painstakingly going through his story over and over again, the ambassador just could not believe what he was hearing. And so, worried Joseph might actually be a well-trained German spy, the ambassador sent him to Odessa to have his credentials verified. But Odessa had the same problem and couldn't verify him, so they sent him to Egypt. Egypt had the same problem, and they too could not verify his credentials. And so they sent him to Italy, where they finally used fingerprints, and they confirmed that yes, this is in fact Joseph R. Byerly. And so on April 11th, 1945, Joseph returned home, and needless to say, his parents were very surprised to see him because they were convinced he died 10 months earlier. 1 year later, Joseph would actually get married in the same church that held his funeral mass when everybody believed he was dead. Joseph was given the Purple Heart, and then in the 1990s was given additional presidential awards from US President Bill Clinton as well as the Russian President Boris Yeltsin. Joseph was also given a custom-made AK-47 from the guy who invented the AK-47. Joseph died in 2004 at the age of 81, and his son would go on to become the US ambassador to Russia under George W. Bush and Barack Obama. In June of 2009, US and NATO forces surged into Afghanistan. Troop numbers escalated dramatically in preparation for this massive offensive against the Taliban. During this surge, a very small team of Marines, 8 Marines, were given a mission to go to an observation post in Helmand province where a group of British soldiers were stationed at the time. An observation post, or OP as it's called in the military, is any location where you're able to observe, hence the name. Most OPs, if not all OPs, are located on high ground because that provides you the best view. OPs are very strategically valuable. You have the higher ground and you can see what's going on around you. And so as a result, OPs become prime targets for attack. Now, the OP that these Marines were going to, OP Rock, was a little bit unique. It was strategically very important, but it didn't really have the higher ground. All around it were other large pieces of terrain, which meant if you poke your head up for too long, you might get shot from a sniper on the mountain. And so OP Rock was like a very dangerous and isolated place to be. Not to mention laughably small and had almost no amenities. It was basically a couple of HESCO barriers, those big brown squares that get filled with sand and dirt to stop bullets, and then, not even cots. They slept literally on the ground on sleeping pads and a couple of ghillie tents overhead. That was about it. And so these Marines were going to be there for 60 days, where they were not going to be able to go anywhere. They were just isolated and stuck on this tiny little wasteland in the middle of Afghanistan. The 8 Marines were led by Sergeant Green, and his second in command was Corporal Lena. The other 6 junior Marines were Zolik, Hoyt, Wilson, Parker, Smith, and Gibbs. After driving their up-armored vehicles all the way through the snaking pass, they get to OP Rock, and the British soldiers are there anxiously waiting for them. Normally, anytime you turn over with any other unit, you do something called turnover operations, where because you're new to the area, you want to go out and do like a presence patrol or something to get a feel for the area with the people who have been there, to kind of give you a lay of the land and say, hey, look out for this area. We think there's IEDs over there. Remember, if you're over here, you're in plain sight of the enemy. They can shoot you. But when they got there, the British were so anxious to leave. They did not do turnover ops. The British just looked totally weathered and beaten down and ragged, like they'd been fighting at OP Rock for decades. But they'd only been there for 60 days, the same amount of time that these Marines are about to be there. And before they leave, one of the British soldiers turns and says, hey, just so you know, if you dig anything up here, just put it back. And the Marines look at him like, what are you talking about? And he doesn't elaborate. He just says again, if you dig anything up, just put it back. Trust me. So that night, the men have settled into their new home for the next 60 days. And the way it works on any base in the world, but certainly in a war zone, is there's always someone manning a guard post. And so the first night, it happened to be Corporal Lena's turn to be on watch. Corporal Lena is the second in command of these 8 Marines. And he was up in the guard tower, and you got to put yourself in his mind, okay? Even if you've never been to Afghanistan, just imagine being out in the middle of nowhere. like in the middle of a mountainous desert with no village, no people, no anything. But at the same time, you are hanging it out there. You are totally exposed. There are people in the mountains around you that want to kill you, for sure. And it's you and 7 other sleeping people right in your little tiny OP. All you got is a radio where you can call back to your main base that's far enough away that if something bad happened, you better hope that 1, you can get through to them, and 2, they can get over here as quickly as they can. And the great fear when you're in these remote locations is that you're going to get ambushed. There's so many stories about these complex attacks being launched on these small little outposts where all of a sudden groups like these 8 Marines just get totally overrun by the Taliban. So it's a terrifying thing. When I was in Afghanistan, I didn't stand all that much guard duty, but when I did, you're up in the shack and you're kind of looking out into this like vast expanse of kind of nothingness. And you're wondering, like, are people watching me right now? Is someone taking aim at me right now? I mean, you're protected and you're doing all the things you're supposed to do, but nighttime in Afghanistan, standing guard duty, it's very eerie. And so this first night, Lena is up there, it's very quiet, and his radio that's right next to him, like imagine like a big walkie-talkie, right? Military grade radio. It starts crackling. Military radios, at least American military radios, are from the 1950s and they have basically not changed. They're very durable and they work, but it's not uncommon for them to falter. And that's why we have people that specialize in just radios that can fix these things for us. Because if you lose your line of communication, you're screwed. And so he's sitting there and he starts hearing crackling on the radio. And so he notices it, but he doesn't think much of it. And the crackling stops and he's looking out into the mountainside and he's kind of looking around and just doing his typical guard duty. Then the crackling picks up again and he thinks he can hear someone speaking in the radio. It didn't sound like English. It didn't sound like even words necessarily, but it was a little bit louder. Now he's really paying attention to it. Because he was worried his radio might be going bad, he first took the battery off, looked at it, blew it off, reconnected the battery, rebooted it, and put it back down. And he's a little more keyed into his radio. And then a couple minutes later, he hears this crackling, and now he can clearly hear someone's voice. And it sounds like Russian. He thinks someone is speaking in Russian. This is an encrypted radio. You're not picking up random signals all over the place. You only are picking up people that have your crypto. And it doesn't make any sense to pick up somebody else's voice. This has to be someone on your team. And so he thinks, okay, I'll check in with the main base because my guys are all asleep right here. They're all sleeping right there, 7 of them. There's no beds. They're laying on the ground right there. I can count them. No one's on the radio. So he picks up the radio and he calls into the main base and he says, hey, is anybody pushing traffic out this way to OP Rock? And like right away, they get a response from the main base that says, no, we're not pushing or receiving traffic. Lena's not terrified about this, but he's like, okay, there's something going on with the radio. The crackling and gurgling and weird sounds would persist throughout the night to the point where the next morning when the next guard came on duty, he said, hey, I think there's something strange going on with the radio. You should probably go switch it out and get somebody else's radio while you're up here. Lena's relieved of guard duty and he goes down to check on the other Marines. And at this point, everybody's awake and, it's the start of their first full day at OP Rock. And because they have nothing else to do besides defend it, they start taking stock of how well fortified is it, what are some ways that we can improve this place, and they notice that there's a trench dug around the inside of OP Rock, basically right up against the Heskos, that allows anyone to stand and not be jutting out of the OP and run the risk of getting shot by a sniper. And they're looking at it and they're thinking to themselves, it's not deep enough. It's maybe a couple feet down. You're certainly not going to be able to stand on this trench. You'll totally be exposed. And they thought, why didn't the British, who were here for 60 days, why didn't they dig a deeper trench? And so Lena and the rest of the Marines decide they're going to spend that day digging the trench a little bit deeper and a little bit wider. As they're digging, Lena hits something metal in the trench. And he pulls it out and it's like this metal stake, like an engineering stake. And he brushes off the dirt on the stake and he's looking at it and he can see some foreign writing and it looks like Russian writing. And he's thinking to himself, oh, that's not that weird. Back in the 80s, the Russians were here and it's totally possible that they may have left some of their gear here and it got buried. About 10 meters away from Lena is one of the younger Marines named Wilson who's digging, and at some point he hits the ground and like a pocket in the soil opens up. And he sees there's some pottery pottery and some pieces of what look like ceramics that are inside of this hole. And after pulling out some of the plates and pots, they pull out a huge human bone, a femur, your leg bone. They ultimately decide to tuck the leg bone back into where it was, and they stop digging in that area and they continue to dig in the other sections of the trench. But they couldn't dig more than a couple inches before running into more human remains. And by the end of the day, they had unearthed dozens of skeletons inside of this trench. And so they realized that this is probably what the British meant when they said, if you dig something up, put it back. A couple of weeks go by and the Marines at this point have accepted that they live in a very creepy place. And on day 13 of being at OP Rock, Hoyt, who had just turned 20 years old, is up on guard duty. As he's sitting there, he starts getting this really uncomfortable feeling that someone is right behind him. And so at one point, he turns around to look at what's behind him, basically looking back into the camp itself. And now, coming from outside the wire where he had just been looking, he hears this horrible, blood-curdling scream. He turns around and he's looking out, he's got his night vision goggles on, he's looking around for anything, and all of a sudden, a couple hundred meters away, he sees a man running between one bush to another bush. Now they know that at any time they could get attacked. So they're not thinking that this could be anything other than the Taliban coming to attack them. And so the other Marines have jumped up because they heard the scream and they're looking to Hoyt to be like, what's going on? Hoyt is saying to them, I got a guy, he's about 200 meters away. I just saw him running right to left. Lena runs over to the edge of the HESCO and he raises his rifle with a thermal imager on it and he's looking out and there's no heat signature out there. It's totally cold. There's no animals, there's no people, certainly, there's nothing. And Lena is yelling to Hoyt, where is he? Where do I need to look? And Hoyt's saying, he's right there. I just saw him go behind that bush. But Lena is looking out and he can't see anything on thermal. And he's like, I don't see anything. There's no one out there. The Marines also had a dog that they inherited from the British soldiers that had been there. Her name was Ugly Betty. They loved Ugly Betty, they took care of her, and she was apparently really good at identifying when people were coming towards the OP. So she was a great watchdog. And this whole time, she had been looking in the same direction that Hoyt had seen this figure, and she is barking like a maniac. And even after they're looking with thermal and they can't see anyone out there, they can't get Betty to calm down. She's completely transfixed on the area where Hoyt had seen this figure. So for the rest of the night, the Marines are totally on guard, anticipating at any moment that they're gonna get attacked. Someone's gonna take a shot, they're gonna throw a grenade in, because we lost this guy who was right there in front of us. So eventually, the next day, when they didn't get attacked, they just kind of said, okay, and they moved on and just figured it was an anomaly. Another couple of weeks later, on day 26, Zolik, who's another one of the younger Marines, was on guard duty, and it was really hot. He remembers even taking his helmet off because he was sweating so bad. And then at some point, while he's just looking out into the vast open nothingness, he said that the temperature dropped inside of the shack dramatically. So much so that he actually felt cold. There was no breeze, there was no reason for it to be getting cold. And as he's thinking to himself, like, is there a storm coming in or a cold front coming in? He starts feeling like someone's standing behind him. And he keeps looking over his shoulder and no one's there. He's in this tiny little shack. And he's feeling creeped out, and all of a sudden he starts hearing whispering from behind him. Not on the radio, but like in the shack with him. And he keeps turning around and he keeps thinking like, am I hearing things? Am I losing my mind? And he starts hearing footsteps on the roof of his shack. And that's when he thinks, oh, Smith, who was the kind of class clown of the group, is playing a joke on me. He must be whispering outside. I bet he climbed up on top and he's screwing with me. So he jumps out of the shack and looks up, expecting to see Smith standing on the roof of the guard shack. But no one's on the guard shack. At this point, Zolik's pretty spooked. He does a quick search on either side of the guard shack, thinking maybe Smith is there, but no one's there. And then he turns around and, of course, sees that the other 7 Marines are all asleep. So it wasn't Smith, it wasn't any of his teammates. At this point, he goes back in the shack and he raises his rifle and he's looking through his thermal scope. So any human would light up like a Christmas tree if you saw them on a thermal. And he's scanning outside all around, thinking, did I hear someone who's out there? Because they had that weird run-in 2 weeks earlier with that random person that they could never find. He's thinking maybe there's somebody else out here. And as he's scanning, he sees a man standing a couple hundred meters away with his fists raised like this. Zolik was so caught off guard from the way he was standing that he actually lowered his rifle to look, because the moon was pretty bright, the illumination was pretty good. And he looked, he couldn't really see him again, so he brought his rifle back up, and now through his thermal, the figure was gone. Zolik in interviews has admitted that he was really stressed out about being at OP Rock. He was really down. I think of all the Marines there, he was depressed. He did not want to be there. He felt like he was experiencing real combat fatigue. And he thought at this moment that he's losing his mind, between the whispering and the footsteps on the roof and seeing this person with his fist raised. And so instead of telling people that he had potentially just seen this person out along the perimeter of their OP, he started to convince himself that you're just losing your mind. You're stressed and you're hallucinating. You just gotta calm down. For the rest of the night, he would not see the figure on his thermal or anybody out there, but he would hear whispering behind him. He kept hearing footsteps on the roof, but he would go out and no one would be there. So by the time the sun came up, he really thought that he was kind of losing his mind. And so he went to his leadership, Sergeant Green and Corporal Lena, and he told them about what had happened the night before, about, seeing the figure that had disappeared and hearing these whispers and the footsteps. I mean, he really thought that he was losing it, and he requested to be transferred, and they granted it to him. And the other 7 Marines were really upset about that. They felt like he was kind of abandoning them, and they were really critical of the reason for him leaving. They're like, oh, you're just playing the crazy card. You're just making that up so you can leave this crappy place that we don't want to be here either. So they were not taking seriously what he claimed happened. They just believed he was using the crazy card to get out of being at OP Rock. Just a couple of days after Zolik's departure, Lena is on guard duty in that guard shack, and as he's looking out, Ugly Betty starts barking really aggressively towards the area that Lena is looking at. And so he raises his night vision goggles and he's scanning the mountainside looking for any sign of people that perhaps Ugly Betty has sensed. And he stops when he sees what he believes is a Taliban scout standing on the mountainside, who's pretty far away, a few hundred meters away, and he switches to his thermal scope to confirm that it's a person before he engages. And when he raises his thermal scope, there's nobody there. There's no heat signature anywhere. But Ugly Betty is still barking like a maniac in the direction of where this potential scout was standing. And so Lena goes back to his night vision goggles like a second later, and he's looking, and he sees the same scout, now about 100 meters closer to him, way closer to him. Like impossible to cover that distance in that amount of time. He practically falls over when he sees it. He switches to his thermal and he's getting ready to engage, but there's nothing there. And this is all happening in a matter of seconds. He goes back to his NVGs and he's looking and there's nothing there. And as he's about to go to his thermal for one last look, he feels a tap on his shoulder, which he believes is going to be one of the other Marines that must have heard him frantically moving around in the guard shack. And when he turns, there's no one there. There's no one anywhere near the shack. All 7 are asleep in the middle of the camp. At this point, Lena felt bad because he was critical of Zolik, who had left because he had heard voices and seen apparitions out in the distance. And here's Lena, the second in command of the group, having the exact same experience. But over the next 10 days, Hoyt, Smith, and Wilson would all have very similar experiences in that guard shack. And after a while, they all began sharing their stories, and they all realized that Zolik probably wasn't lying, and we were unfair to be critical of him because we've all experienced this now. Then on day 59, the day before they're scheduled to leave, all of their radios go dead, all of them. And Lena goes over to Gibbs, who was their comms guy, and he's like, what's going on? And Gibbs was like, I've been working on the radios this whole time we're here. I've changed nothing. They've always worked. Now, they did have a satellite phone, but it was an unreliable way to get in touch with reinforcements if you really needed it. They're pretty much isolated at this point, and they're all just sitting there, just hoping they can get through one more night without any problems. Wilson is the one actually in the guard shack, and then all of a sudden, machine gun fire opens up right outside of their base. And Wilson is totally caught off guard. He has no idea where it's coming from. He's trying to call it out to the guys where they're getting shot from. And all the other Marines are scrambling to the walls. They're taking cover behind the Hescos. And as they're laying there, Lena runs up into the guard shack with Wilson. He's like, he grabs him and he's like, where are they shooting us from? And Wilson's like, I have no idea. And it's like, it's so loud. There's all this gunfire coming in at them. And as Lena and Wilson are trying to figure out where this is coming from, they hear the distinctive sound of an RPG being fired at them. It's a rocket-propelled grenade. It's like a whistling sound, and they know it's going to hit them at any moment. The two of them brace for impact, and they hear the sound of this RPG smashing on the side of the OP, and the machine gun fire is just continuing. It's a non-stop. And so a couple of the other younger Marines basically low-crawled their way into the trench where they were protected from these rounds, and they're thinking, like, we got to make sure no one's in the trenches. And so they start clearing the trenches, but no one's in the trench. And it's just this constant barrage of gunfire. They have no idea where it's coming from. And then just as suddenly as it started, the gunfire stops and it's silent. As soon as the shooting stopped, the Marines did not just poke their head up and say everything's fine now. If you're being shot at, you assume that even if there's a break in the gunfire, they're going to start shooting at you again. And so for hours, they're just like waiting for the next round of fire to start, but they don't even know where it's coming from. And they're kind of isolated and exposed. So they're all just kind of like hunkered down against the HESC codes waiting to respond to the next volley of fire. But it never comes. And when the sun comes up, they're able to take stock of the damage to their OP from all the machine gun fire and from the rocket-propelled grenade. But there's no damage. No one had ever been shooting at the OP. There was no damage. So they had no explanation for it. So when reinforcements arrived, they just wanted to pack their stuff up and get the heck out of there. And they did. After leaving OP Rock, very shortly after, Smith, Parker, and Diggs, 3 of the 8 Marines that were there, were all killed in Afghanistan in separate instances. And then Sergeant Green, who was their leader, was very badly injured in an IED blast. Lena believes that when they were digging out those trenches and finding all those bones, that they unleashed something. It turned out a lot of people had lost their lives on that little strip of rock. When the Russians invaded Afghanistan, they captured OP Rock and killed all of the Mujahideen that were located at OP Rock. Then the Taliban came in and they took back OP Rock from the Russians and killed all the Russians that were at OP Rock. Then Americans came in and took back OP Rock from the Taliban, killing all the Taliban that were there. So you have all these people, probably dozens and dozens of people that at one point have been holding OP Rock, that had all been killed at OP Rock. And so Lena believes that it's only a matter of time before this curse that they unleashed comes back to get him. So I'd love to get your reaction. What do you think happened at OP Rock? Is this paranormal, or is there a rational explanation for this? Let me know in the comments and I'll do my best to get back to as many of you as I possibly can. If you enjoyed this story and you haven't done this already, please play Ding Dong Ditch on the like button's house, and then also subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please offer the like button a bag of Revels, but only leave the coffee flavored kind. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications